The bullet had already passed through the girl's shoulder when Caleb Reed found her. She couldn't have been more than 14 summers, folded against the split-rail fence like discarded cloth, her deerskin dress dark with blood that looked black in the failing light. The wound still wept. Her breathing came shallow and quick, the kind that meant the body was deciding whether to fight or surrender. Caleb stood 20 feet back, rifle lowered, but ready, watching the tree line. The shot had come from somewhere east, maybe an hour past. Whoever fired it was either long gone or lying in wait to see who'd come for her. The girl's eyes tracked him, dark, alert, afraid, but not pleading. She didn't make a sound. He'd lived 7 years on this patch of Texas hardpan without wanting company of any kind. The ranch house stood a quarter-mile behind him, small and weathered, the only structure for 15 miles in any direction. He'd chosen this place for its emptiness. After what happened in Sonora, after the ambush that took his wife and daughter, after the things he'd done in return, Caleb had learned that isolation was the only honest way to live with what he'd become. The girl shifted slightly, her hand moving to the wound. Her fingers came away red. Caleb studied the horizon one more time. Sunset bled orange and purple across the grassland, shadows stretching long and thin. No movement, no sound but wind through mesquite and the distant cry of a hawk circling something dead. He made his decision the way he made all decisions now, quickly, without ceremony, knowing it would cost him something. "I'm coming toward you," he said quietly. "Don't run." She watched him approach, her breath hitching when he knelt beside her. Up close, he could see the delicate beadwork on her dress, the silver amulet at her throat shaped like a bird in flight. Her hair was braided with strips of red cloth. Someone loved her. Someone was looking for her. The bullet had gone clean through, which was good. The wound was high enough to have missed the lung, which was better. But she'd lost blood, and the dress fabric had carried dirt into the hole. Without care, infection would take her in 3 days. "I'm not going to hurt you," Caleb said. She spoke then, a single word in Apache he didn't understand. Her voice was steady, despite the pain. He could leave her, ride to the house, bar the door, let the situation resolve itself beyond his fence line. That would be the smart thing, the safe thing. The girl's people would find her, or they wouldn't. Either way, it wouldn't be his burden to carry. But he thought of Maria, his daughter, who would have been about this age now. Maria, who died crying for him while he'd been 2 valleys away, too far to hear, too late to save. Caleb slipped his arms beneath the girl and lifted her carefully. She was lighter than he expected, all bone and sinew. She stiffened, but didn't fight. "Easy now," he murmured. "I've got you." The walk back to the house took 10 minutes. Full dark was coming fast. He shouldered through the door and laid her on his bed, the only bed, the mattress stuffed with prairie grass that crackled under her weight. She stared at the ceiling beams while he lit 2 lanterns and gathered what he needed: whiskey, clean cloth torn from an old shirt, needle and thread, a knife heated red in the stove flame. "This is going to hurt," he said, though he knew she didn't understand the words. Maybe she understood the tone. When he poured whiskey into the wound, she bit down on her lip hard enough to draw blood but made no sound. Her hands gripped the blanket, knuckles white. Caleb worked quickly, cleaning the entry and exit wounds, checking for fabric or debris. The bullet had been small caliber, probably from a pistol. Someone had shot her up close. He threaded the needle by lamplight and began to stitch. The girl's eyes never left the ceiling. Once, her breathing hitched and tears slipped down her temples into her hair, but still she stayed quiet. Caleb had seen grown men scream for less. When it was done, he bandaged both sides of her shoulder with strips of clean cotton and stepped back. His hands were shaking slightly. He hadn't touched another person in 3 years. "You can rest now," he said. The girl's eyes finally moved to his face. She studied him for a long moment, then spoke again in Apache, several words this time, soft and deliberate. Caleb shook his head. "I don't understand." She lifted her good hand and touched her chest, then pointed at him, a question in her eyes. "Caleb," he said, touching his own chest. "My name is Caleb." She repeated it carefully, the syllables strange in her mouth. "Caleb." Then she touched her own chest. "Nalin, Nalin," he echoed. She nodded once, then closed her eyes. Caleb watched her breathe for a while. The rise and fall of her chest evening out as exhaustion pulled her under. He should sleep too. Morning would bring decisions he wasn't ready to make. But he sat in the chair by the window instead, rifle across his knees, and watched the darkness outside. Somewhere in that darkness men were looking for this girl. Maybe white men who'd attacked her. Maybe her own people who'd lost her in the chaos. Either way, they'd come eventually. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Caleb listened to it and thought about mercy, and whether a man like him was still allowed to offer it. Nolan slept through the night without fever, which surprised Caleb. He'd seen men die from cleaner wounds than hers. He didn't sleep at all. He sat by the window, watching the land turn from black to gray to pale gold as dawn approached. His coffee had gone cold in its cup hours ago. The rifle stayed in his hands, familiar as prayer. Around 4 in the morning, he'd heard something, hoofbeats, distant and slow, circling wide around the property. Could have been wild mustangs, could have been scouts. Either way, they hadn't come closer, and by the time the eastern sky began to lighten, the sound had faded completely. Nolan stirred as sunlight crept through the window. Her eyes opened slowly, confusion crossing her face before memory returned. She tried to sit up and gasped, her hand moving to her bandaged shoulder. "Stay down," Caleb said, crossing to the bed. "You'll tear the stitches." She looked at him warily, but settled back against the pillow. Her face was pale beneath her brown skin, and sweat beaded on her forehead. The wound would hurt worse today than it had last night. That was the way of it. He brought her water in a tin cup, helping her drink. She took small sips, watching him over the rim. When she'd had enough, she pushed the cup away gently and spoke in Apache, the words flowing like water over stones. Caleb set the cup aside. "I wish I understood you." She seemed to consider this, then raised her good hand and made a series of gestures, pointing to herself, then toward the east, then making a cradling motion with her arms. Her face was grave. "You have a child?" Caleb asked. "A baby?" Nolan shook her head quickly, frustrated. She tried again, this time pointing to herself, then making the cradling motion, then pointing to her own chest where her heart would be. Her eyes were urgent. "Someone you love?" Caleb said quietly. "Someone you need to get back to?" She nodded, relief flooding her face. Then she pointed east again and held up both hands, fingers splayed. 10. She repeated the gesture 5 times. 50 people, maybe her band, her family. "They're looking for you," Caleb said. Another nod. She touched her shoulder gently, wincing, then looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complex. She spoke one more word. "Shilnaya-i." The word hung in the air between them. Caleb had heard it before, years ago, from an Apache scout who'd worked with the cavalry. It meant friend, or maybe stranger. The translation had never been clear. Outside, his horse whinnied nervously from the small corral. Caleb stood and moved to the window, scanning the horizon. Nothing, but the horse knew something he didn't. "I need to check the perimeter," he said, more to himself than to her. "Stay here, don't try to move." He took his rifle and stepped onto the porch. The morning air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. The land stretched empty in all directions, rolling grassland broken by mesquite and scrub oak, the hills rising purple in the far distance. But his horse was still agitated, pacing the corral fence. Caleb walked the property line slowly, reading the ground the way his father had taught him 30 years ago. Near the eastern fence, he found what he was looking for. Unshod hoofprints, at least 6 horses, maybe more. They'd circled in the night, staying just beyond rifle range, watching. He crouched and touched the nearest track, still sharp-edged, made within the last few hours. They knew she was here. The question was what they'd do about it. If they were her people, they might approach peacefully. If they were the ones who'd shot her, bounty hunters, slavers, soldiers, they'd come with violence. Either way, keeping her here was a death sentence, for her, for him, or for both. Caleb stood and looked back at the house. Through the window, he could see Nalan's silhouette on the bed, small and still. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, the kind of girl who'd grown up learning which plants healed and which killed, how to track deer through pine forest, how to sing the old songs that kept the world in balance. His own daughter had been learning to read when she died. She'd loved wildflowers and the color yellow. She'd called him Papa and believed he could protect her from anything. He'd been wrong about that, wrong about everything. Caleb walked back to the house slowly, his decision already made. It was probably the wrong one. Most of his decisions were. But he'd pulled this girl from death's doorway, and he'd see her safely through to the other side, even if it cost him whatever years he had left. Inside, Nalan was sitting up despite his instructions, her face tight with pain and determination. She'd somehow managed to swing her legs over the side of the bed. "Stubborn," Caleb muttered. She looked at him and spoke urgently, gesturing toward the door. She wanted to leave, probably thought she was putting him in danger by staying. She was right about that. "You can't walk 5 feet, let alone 15 miles, Caleb said. "You'll rest today. Tonight, if you're strong enough, I'll take you part way. Close enough for your people to find you." He didn't know if she understood, but something in his tone must have communicated his intent. She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly and eased herself back down onto the bed. Caleb made coffee and cornbread, bringing her small portions that she ate carefully with her good hand. They sat in silence, the morning light growing stronger through the windows. Outside, the land baked under an indifferent sun. Around noon, the horse whinnied again. Caleb grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. At first he saw nothing. Then movement caught his eye. A single rider on the northern ridge, maybe half a mile out. Too far to make out details, but the figure sat motionless on horseback, watching the house. After 5 minutes, the rider turned and disappeared over the ridge. Caleb's jaw tightened. They were being observed, assessed. Whatever was coming, it would come soon. He checked his ammunition. 30 rounds for the rifle, 18 for his pistol. Not nearly enough if they came in numbers. The house had thick adobe walls and narrow windows, built for defense, but he was one man. One tired, half-broken man who'd already buried everyone he'd ever loved. Nalin watched him from the bed, her eyes dark and knowing. She understood the danger, even if she didn't understand his words. "We'll wait for nightfall," Caleb said quietly. "Then we move." But even as he said it, he wondered if nightfall would come in time. The afternoon crawled by like something wounded. Caleb moved between the windows, tracking the sun's arc across a sky too blue and empty. No more riders appeared on the ridges, but their absence felt worse than their presence. He knew how this worked. The watching, the waiting, the careful calculation of weakness and strength before the strike came. He'd done it himself, back when he still believed in causes worth killing for. Nalin drifted in and out of sleep, her body working to heal itself. When she woke around 3, Caleb brought her more water and dried beef that she chewed slowly, her eyes following him around the small room. She seemed to be taking measure of him the same way he'd been measuring the land, looking for faults, for fractures, for the places where pressure would break through. You should eat more," he said, though he knew she couldn't understand. The words were as much for his own benefit as hers. A way to fill the silence that pressed against the walls like a living thing. Yeah. She took another small piece of beef, then pointed at him and gestured to her mouth. "Eat. You need to eat too." Caleb realized he hadn't eaten since yesterday. He cut a piece of bread and forced it down, tasting nothing. His body was running on coffee and momentum, the same fuel that had kept him alive through worse situations than this. Through the west window, he watched dust devils spin across the grassland, carrying topsoil into the air in brief, violent spirals before collapsing. The wind was picking up. By evening, there'd be weather coming in from the mountains. He could feel it in the way the air pressed against his skin, heavy and expectant. Storm weather. The kind that made men do foolish things or gave them cover for doing them. Nalin spoke suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been, a full sentence in Apache, the syllables rising and falling like music. She was looking directly at him, her expression serious. "I don't know what you're saying," Caleb said, "but I'm listening." She seemed to understand that much. She pointed at him, then at herself, then made a gesture he'd seen before, hand over heart. Then she pointed toward the door and shook her head firmly. "No," she was telling him not to risk himself for her. Too late for that," Caleb said quietly. He thought about trying to explain to her that mercy wasn't a choice you made, not really. It was something that happened to you, something that grabbed hold and wouldn't let go no matter how much safer it would be to walk away. He'd walked away from too many things already. He'd walked away from his wife's grave in Sonora without saying goodbye, walked away from the burned village where he'd found the men who killed her, walked away from the army and the law and everything that asked him to be more than just a man trying to survive his own memories. He couldn't walk away. From this, around 4, the horse began pacing again. Caleb went outside, rifle in hand, and scanned the perimeter. The land looked empty, but emptiness in Texas was never to be trusted. The mesquite was thick enough to hide a dozen men if they knew what they were doing, and the afternoon shadows were already growing long. He checked the horse's water trough and distributed grain, working with the automatic movements of someone who'd done this 10,000 times before. The mare, a buckskin named Sarah, after no one in particular, pressed her nose against his shoulder. Animals knew when trouble was close. They could smell it in the air, taste it in the wind. "I know, girl," Caleb murmured. "I know." Back inside, he found Nalin sitting up again, her jaw set with determination. She'd somehow managed to stand, using the bed frame for support, and was trying to take a step toward the door. Her face was white with pain and effort. "Damn fool girl," Caleb said, but there was admiration in his voice as he crossed quickly to support her. Lying down wasn't a suggestion. She leaned against him heavily, her breath coming fast. Up close, he could smell sage and smoke in her hair and something else, a sweetness like prairie flowers. She was someone's whole world, he thought. Someone was counting days until she came home. He helped her back to the bed, and this time she didn't resist. The effort had cost her. Sweat darkened her forehead, and her bandage showed a small bloom of red where the exertion had opened the wound slightly. Caleb unwrapped the bandage carefully, relieved to see the bleeding was minimal. He cleaned it again with whiskey, and this time Nalin gripped his wrist with her good hand, holding on through the pain. Her grip was strong. When he finished and looked up, he found her watching him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Shilnai," she said again. "Friend or stranger?" Both, maybe. I'm neither, Caleb said. Just a man who happened to be here. But that wasn't true, and they both knew it. He could have left her at the fence, could have turned his back and let the desert make its own decisions. He'd chosen differently, and choice made all the difference between accident and intent. Nalin released his wrist and spoke again, longer this time, her voice taking on a storytelling cadence. She gestured as she talked, pointing to the east, making the shape of mountains with her hands, then touching her heart and her eyes. She was telling him something important, something about her people, maybe, or about herself. He wished desperately that he could understand. When she finished, she looked at him expectantly, as if waiting for a response to a question he hadn't quite heard. I'll get you home, Caleb said. That's a promise. She nodded slowly, though he wasn't sure if she'd understood the words or just the tone. Then she reached up with her good hand and touched his face briefly, her fingers cool against his weathered skin. The gesture was so unexpected, so gentle that Caleb froze. She pulled her hand back and settled into the bed, closing her eyes. Caleb stood there for a moment, something tight and painful moving in his chest. He couldn't remember the last time someone had touched him with kindness. After Maria and Catherine died, he'd become a ghost among men, present but untouchable, seen but never really noticed. He'd preferred it that way. Touch meant connection, and connection meant the possibility of loss, and he'd lost enough for 3 lifetimes. But this girl with her wounded shoulder and her stubborn courage had reached out anyway, as if to say, I see you, I know what you're risking, thank you. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. The light was beginning to fail, sliding toward that golden hour before dusk. Caleb returned to his chair by the window and watched the land change color, thinking about the night ahead. They'd need to move carefully, get her on the horse, ride east toward where her people must be searching, get close enough that they'd find her come morning. Then he'd come back here and wait for whatever consequences followed, because there would be consequences. There always were. The sun touched the western hills, spreading red and gold across the sky like a promise of fire. Caleb loaded his rifle, checked his pistol, and prepared to break another promise to himself about staying uninvolved in other people's wars. Some promises, he thought, were meant to be broken. Behind him, Nalin's breathing had evened out in sleep. Outside, the horse whinnied one more time as full darkness began to fall, and somewhere in that darkness, men were moving closer. They left at midnight under a sky so thick with stars it looked like spilled milk across black cloth. Caleb had waited until the moon rose, a thin crescent that gave just enough light to see by without exposing them completely. He'd spent the evening preparing, filling canteens, packing dried meat and hardtack, loading extra ammunition into his saddlebags. Preparing, he knew, for a journey he might not complete. Nalin had watched him work, her eyes bright with fever that had finally come. Her forehead was hot when he checked it, but not dangerously so. The infection was beginning, but slowly. She had time, not much, but enough. We're leaving, he said, when everything was ready. Can you ride? She didn't understand the words, but she understood his tone. She nodded and struggled to sit up. This time Caleb helped her without comment, supporting her weight as she stood on unsteady legs. She swayed once, her good hand gripping his shirt, but she stayed upright. That's it, he murmured, just like that. He'd fashioned a sling for her injured arm using strips of cloth, binding it tight against her chest to minimize movement. She'd need both stability and mobility if they encountered trouble, and he couldn't give her both, so he chose stability and hoped it would be enough. Getting her to the horse was the first challenge. She could barely walk, and every step sent visible pain across her face, but she didn't make a sound, just concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other, her jaw clenched tight. By the time they reached the corral, she was trembling with effort. Sarah stood calm and patient while Caleb lifted Nalin into the saddle. The girl gasped when her shoulder shifted, but she found her balance quickly, gripping the saddle horn with her good hand. He'd chosen Sarah specifically because she was steady, unflappable, the kind of horse that wouldn't spook at shadows. Caleb swung up behind her, settling himself carefully so he could support her without jarring her wound. She leaned back against him slightly, and he could feel the heat of her fever through both their clothes. Stay with me, he said quietly. Stay awake if you can. He guided Sarah east, away from the house, moving slowly through the darkness. The night was alive with sound. Crickets singing their endless song, an owl calling from somewhere in the mesquite, the whisper of wind through grass. Normal sounds, the kind that told him they were alone. For now. They rode for 2 hours, following game trails that wound through the scrubland. Caleb kept them to low ground where possible, avoiding ridgelines where they'd be silhouetted against the sky. The land here was familiar to him. He'd hunted it, walked it, learned its moods and dangers during his years of isolation. That knowledge might keep them alive tonight. Nalin was flagging. He could feel her weight growing heavier against him, her body relaxing into unconsciousness despite her efforts to stay alert. Twice she jerked awake, startled, before slumping back again. The fever was pulling her under. Not yet, Caleb murmured. Hold on just a little longer. Around 2 in the morning, Sarah's ears swiveled forward sharply. Caleb reined her in immediately, his hand moving to the rifle strapped to the saddle. He listened hard, filtering through the night sounds for anything wrong. There. Voices, distant and low, coming from the south, maybe a quarter mile away. Men talking, the words too soft to distinguish, but the tone unmistakable. Hunters, trackers, people moving with purpose through the dark. Caleb adjusted his grip on Nellen and urged Sarah forward again, faster now, trading caution for speed. They needed distance, needed to put enough land between themselves and whoever was behind them that morning would find them beyond reach. The girl stirred, sensing the urgency. She lifted her head and spoke, her voice thick with fever. The words were slurred but urgent. A warning, maybe, or a question. Her good hand tightened on the saddle horn. I know, Caleb said. I hear them too. He pushed Sarah into a ground-eating trot, the fastest pace he dared in the darkness. The horse responded smoothly, her years of trail work showing in how she picked her way through the terrain without stumbling. Behind them, the voices faded, swallowed by distance and wind. By 3, they'd covered perhaps 8 miles. Caleb's back ached from holding Nellen upright, and his shoulder throbbed where an old wound had never quite healed. He was getting too old for this kind of thing. Too old and too tired and too full of ghosts. But he kept riding. The land began to change as they moved east. More broken now, cut through with arroyos and studded with boulder formations that rose like sentinels in the starlight. This was Apache country proper, the kind of terrain that favored defenders and punished invaders. If her people were anywhere, they'd be here in these rocks and canyons where cavalry horses broke their legs and white men lost their way. Caleb found a sheltered spot where 2 large boulders leaned against each other, creating a small cave-like space. He dismounted carefully and lifted Nalen down, carrying her into the shelter. She was burning with fever now, muttering in Apache, her eyes moving beneath closed lids. He laid her on his bedroll and covered her with his coat. Then he checked her bandage, relieved to see no fresh blood. The wound itself looked angry and hot, but not corrupted. Not yet. She'd need proper medicine soon, the kind her people would know how to make from desert plants and prayers he didn't understand. You're close now, he told her, though she couldn't hear him. Close to home. They'll find you come morning. He built no fire, too risky, but he sat beside her in the darkness and waited for dawn. Sarah stood nearby, ground-tied, her head low as she rested. Around them the desert breathed its slow, patient breath, caring nothing for the small human dramas played out on its surface. Caleb thought about the house he'd left behind. It would be empty now, just walls and windows and the ghost of his own loneliness. He'd probably never see it again. The men who'd been tracking them would find it, and they'd either burn it or claim it, and either way it would cease to be his. 7 years of careful isolation erased in a single night of foolish compassion. He found he didn't care as much as he thought he would. Nalen stirred, opening her eyes. They were glassy with fever, unfocused, but they found his face in the darkness. She spoke, the words barely a whisper, and reached out with her good hand. He took it, surprised by how small it felt in his calloused palm. Shilna'i, she said again. Friend. Yeah, Caleb said softly. I suppose I am. She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and closed her eyes again. Her hand stayed in his, holding on as sleep pulled her under. Caleb sat there in the darkness, holding the hand of a dying Apache girl who'd somehow become the first person he'd cared about in 7 years, and watched the eastern sky begin to pale toward dawn. He didn't pray. He'd stopped believing in prayers after Sonora, but he hoped anyway, in that wordless way that humans do when they've run out of better options. Hoped that her people would find her, hoped that she'd live, hoped that mercy for once might be repaid with mercy instead of violence. The stars began to fade, the world prepared itself for morning, and somewhere in the growing light, destiny was riding toward them on painted horses carrying questions Caleb didn't know how to answer. Dawn came slowly, bleeding pale gold across the eastern horizon like a wound that wouldn't clot. Caleb hadn't slept. He'd spent the last hour of darkness watching the land wake, shadows retreating into rocks, birds beginning their morning arguments, the air turning from cool to merely warm. Nalen slept beside him, her fever finally breaking near sunrise, her breathing deep and even for the first time since he'd found her. He'd have to leave soon, that was the plan. Get her close enough for her people to find, then disappear back into the scrubland before anyone saw him. Clean, simple, survivable. The plan lasted until the sun cleared the horizon. Sarah whinnied, sharp and nervous. Caleb grabbed his rifle and moved to the edge of the boulder shelter, scanning the terrain. At first he saw nothing. Then movement caught his eye. Riders coming from the northeast, perhaps a mile away. Too many to count at this distance, but enough that the ground itself seemed to shift beneath them. Not a hunting party, not scouts, an army. Caleb's chest tightened. He'd expected maybe a dozen warriors, a search party looking for their lost girl. What he was seeing looked like 50 men, maybe more, riding in formation with the kind of discipline that spoke of serious intent. They weren't searching, they were advancing. Behind him, Nalin stirred and sat up slowly, her good hand pressed against the boulder for support. She saw the riders and went completely still. Then she spoke, one word, soft and filled with something between awe and fear. Dandaigo. Caleb didn't know the word, but he understood the tone. These were her people, and they were coming in force. "Can you stand?" he asked, already knowing he needed to move quickly. If he could get to Sarah, get mounted, he might be able to ride west before they spotted him. Might. But Nayland shook her head and grabbed his arm with surprising strength. She pointed at the riders, then at herself, then at him. Her meaning was clear. "They're coming for me. If you run, they'll hunt you." That's what I'm counting on," Caleb muttered. He helped her to her feet anyway, supporting her weight as they moved toward the horse. Sarah was dancing nervously, picking up on his tension. He'd just gotten Nalin positioned against the boulder, stable enough to stand alone, when he heard it, the sound of horses much closer than they should be. He spun, rifle coming up, and found himself facing 3 Apache warriors who'd approached from the south, silent as smoke. They sat their horses 20 yards away, weapons ready but not raised. The nearest was an older man with gray streaking his long hair, his face carved by sun and wind into something ancient and knowing. He studied Caleb with dark eyes that missed nothing. Nobody moved. The moment stretched thin and dangerous. Then Nalin called out, her voice weak but clear, speaking rapidly in Apache. The gray-haired warrior's eyes shifted to her, widening slightly when he saw her condition. He barked something to his companions, a question, sharp and urgent. Nalin responded, still talking, gesturing toward Caleb with her good hand. She spoke for perhaps 30 seconds, and as she did, the expressions on the warriors' faces changed, not softening exactly, but shifting from hostility to something more complex, confusion maybe, or disbelief. When she finished, silence fell again. The gray-haired man looked back at Caleb, his gaze moving to the rifle, then to Nalin's bandaged shoulder, then to Caleb's face, reading the situation, making calculations. Finally, he spoke. His English was careful and precise, carrying the weight of someone who'd learned the language late but well. "You are the one who took the bullet from her body." It wasn't a question, but Caleb answered anyway. "Yes. She was shot by white men, buffalo hunters 3 days south. She ran far before the wound took her." Caleb nodded slowly, pieces clicking together. Buffalo hunters were the worst kind of scavengers. Men who killed for sport and profit, who'd shoot an Apache girl just for being Apache, just for being there. "Why did you not leave her to die?" the warrior asked. It was a fair question. Caleb searched for an answer that would make sense, that would explain the unexplainable. She was someone's daughter," he said finally. That was enough. The warrior's expression didn't change, but something moved behind his eyes. He exchanged glances with his companions, some silent communication passing between them. Then he looked back at Caleb. "My name is Naiche. Nalin is daughter to my sister. You have given her life when you could have taken your own safety." He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "This creates obligation. Do you understand obligation?" "I understand debt," Caleb said. "Not debt. Debt can be repaid and forgotten. Obligation is deeper." Knight gestured toward the approaching riders, who were now close enough that Caleb could see individual faces. "My brother leads these men. He is coming to find his daughter. He is coming to bring war to the men who shot her." "That's not me," Caleb said. "No, but you are white. You are alone. You carry weapons." Nietzsche's voice remained level, but the implications were clear. "My brother Goyakla is not a patient man. He sees enemies where others might see questions." Caleb's grip tightened on his rifle. "Goyakla." The name was familiar, though he couldn't place it. "What happens now? Now you put down your weapon. Now you let us take Nalin to be healed. Now you stand before Goyakla and let him see what his daughter sees." Nietzsche leaned forward slightly. "If you run, he will hunt you. If you fight, he will kill you. If you stand, maybe you live. Maybe." It wasn't much of a choice. Caleb looked at Nalin, who was watching him with wide, fever-bright eyes. She spoke again urgently, pleading with Nietzsche in rapid Apache. Her uncle shook his head, responding in their language, his tone gentle but firm. "She asks us to let you go," Nietzsche translated. "She says you have risked enough. I tell her this is not her choice to make. The main body of riders was almost upon them now. Caleb could see the leader, a man in his 40s riding a powerful paint horse, his face a mask of controlled fury. Even at this distance, Caleb could feel the force of his presence. This was someone who commanded not through position, but through pure intensity of will. Your rifle, Nietzsche said quietly. Now, before it becomes insult. Caleb looked at the weapon in his hands, the Winchester that had been his companion for 7 years, that had kept him alive through encounters that should have killed him. Putting it down felt like surrendering more than just a weapon. It felt like surrendering the last of whatever armor he'd built between himself and the world, but he lowered it anyway, setting it carefully on the ground at his feet. Then he straightened and waited, empty-handed, for whatever was coming. The riders arrived like a storm, condensing into human form. Goyakla dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, hitting the ground with a warrior's grace and moving immediately toward Nalin. His face transformed when he saw her, the fury giving way to something raw and terrible. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her bandaged shoulder as if afraid to touch, afraid to hurt her further. She spoke to him softly, and he pulled her against his chest with infinite care, his eyes closing. For a moment, the dangerous man disappeared, replaced by just a father holding his wounded child. The other warriors gave them space, forming a loose perimeter, their attention split between the reunion and Caleb. Nietzsche dismounted and moved to stand beside Caleb. "Do not speak unless spoken to," he said quietly. "Do not move. Show no fear, but no arrogance either. You are balanced on the edge of a knife." Goyakla held his daughter for perhaps a minute, speaking to her in tones too low to hear. Then he stood slowly, passing her to 2 women who'd ridden with the war party, healers from the medicine pouches they carried. They began examining her shoulder immediately, unwrapping Caleb's bandages with practiced efficiency. Only then did Goyakla turn to face Caleb. The man was shorter than Caleb by several inches, but he carried himself with such compressed power that he seemed to fill all available space. His eyes were black and utterly without compromise, the eyes of someone who'd seen too much death to be moved by threats or pleading. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, white against brown skin. He wore traditional Apache clothing, but carried a modern rifle, the marriage of old ways and new necessities. He studied Caleb in silence, his gaze moving from face to hands to stance, reading everything. The moment stretched until it became almost unbearable. "Nietzsche tells me you saved my daughter's life," Goyakla said finally. His English was less polished than his brother's, but perfectly clear. "Tell me why." She was dying," Caleb said simply. "I couldn't walk away from that." "Many white men could. Many have walked away from much worse than one dying Apache girl." Goyakla's voice carried no emotion, just flat statement of fact. "So I ask again, why?" Caleb met his eyes and made a decision to speak truth, even if truth got him killed. "I had a daughter once. She was about Nalan's age when she died. I wasn't there to save her. So when I found your daughter bleeding at my fence..." He trailed off, searching for words. "I couldn't leave her. Not again." Something flickered across Goyakla's face. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition, the acknowledgement of one grieving father to another. "Where is your daughter now?" "In the ground, in Mexico, 7 years ago." "How did she die?" "Comancheros. Raided the ranch where we were staying. Killed my wife, my daughter, 3 ranch hands. I was in the hills hunting." Caleb's voice stayed level through force of will. "By the time I got back, it was over." Goyakla nodded slowly. "And the Comancheros?" "Dead. All of them." Caleb didn't elaborate, and Goyakla didn't ask. Some stories didn't need details. One of the healers spoke up, calling to Goyakla. He turned, and she showed him Nalan's shoulder, the clean entry and exit wounds, the careful stitching, the bandages that had kept infection at bay. She spoke at length, gesturing to the work, her tone professional and approving. When she finished, Goyakla looked back at Caleb with new interest. "White Eyes did good work. The stitches are small and even. The wound is clean. My daughter lives because of this skill." He paused. "Where did you learn to heal?" "Army surgeon taught me during the war. Said if I was going to keep getting shot, I might as well learn to patch myself up." The faintest trace of something like humor touched Goyakla's eyes. "You have been shot many times?" "Enough to know I don't enjoy it." Several of the warriors chuckled, brief and quickly suppressed, but genuine. Even Nietzsche's stern expression cracked slightly. Goyakla raised his hand, and silence fell immediately. He spoke in Apache, addressing the assembled warriors. His words had the cadence of formal speech, of pronouncement. When he finished, several men responded in what sounded like agreement or affirmation. "I have told my warriors that you are not our enemy," Goyakla said to Caleb, "that you have given life instead of taking it." And this makes you different from other white men we have known. His expression hardened. But there are questions that need answers. The buffalo hunters who shot my daughter, you know of them. No, I live alone. Don't keep track of what other white men are doing. They are 3 days' ride south, camped near the Red Canyon. 30 men, maybe more. They kill buffalo for hides and leave the meat to rot. They kill any Apache they see, for sport or for the bounty the Mexican government pays. Goyacla's voice went cold. Yesterday they shot my daughter when she was gathering medicine plants. She ran. They tracked her for hours before losing her trail. If you had not found her, they would have. Caleb felt sick. He knew the type. Men who'd turned killing into casual entertainment, who measured their manhood by body counts and trophy scalps. The kind of men who made good people believe that all frontier violence was justified. No, what will you do? He asked, though he already knew. What must be done? We ride to Red Canyon at sunset. The buffalo hunters will not see tomorrow's dawn. Goyakla stepped closer, his eyes boring into Caleb's. But first I must know, where do you stand, White Eyes? Will you ride south and warn them? Will you raise your gun against us if we meet again? It was the most important question of Caleb's life, and he knew it. How he answered would determine not just his immediate survival, but something larger. What kind of man he'd choose to be in the time he had left. He thought about the buffalo hunters, men who'd shoot a 14-year-old girl for the crime of existing. He thought about his own daughter, who'd died because men with guns decided her life didn't matter. He thought about 7 years of isolation, of believing that staying separate from the world's violence was the same as staying clean of it. He'd been wrong about that, too. I won't warn them, Caleb said clearly, and I won't stand in your way. What you do to men who shoot children isn't my concern. Goyakla studied him for a long moment. Good. Then you will come with us. Caleb blinked. What? You will ride with us to Red Canyon. You will watch what happens to men who harm Apache children, and when it is over, you will return to your home and remember what you saw. Goyakla's voice allowed no argument. This is not request. This is obligation. You saved one life. Now you will witness how we protect all our lives. You will understand who we are. And when white men ask you what happened at Red Canyon, you will tell them truth. I'm not a warrior, Caleb protested. I'm not. You are man who stopped running long enough to save a dying girl? That makes you more warrior than most. Goyakla turned to his brother. Naiche, give him back his rifle. We leave when the sun begins to fall. Naiche picked up Caleb's Winchester and handed it to him, along with something else, a strip of red cloth, the same kind Nalin wore in her hair. Tie this around your arm, he said quietly, so our warriors know you are under Goyakla's protection. Without it, you will not survive the night. Caleb took the cloth, feeling its weight like an anchor. Who is Goyakla? He asked. I know that name, but I can't place it. Naiche's expression was unreadable. The Mexicans call him Geronimo. Perhaps you know that name better. The world seemed to tilt slightly. Geronimo, the name every soldier and settler knew. The Apache leader who'd fought 3 nations to a standstill, who'd escaped more traps than seemed humanly possible, whose very name had become shorthand for fierce resistance. The man standing 20 feet away holding his wounded daughter was a legend carved from violence and survival, and Caleb had just agreed to ride into battle beside him. God help me, he muttered. Your God does not ride with us, Naiche said, but perhaps yours will listen better than most. You will need all the help gods can give, White Eyes. What comes tonight will be terrible and necessary. Make certain you can live with both. They rode south as the sun began its descent, a force of 70 warriors moving like a single organism across the desert floor. Caleb rode near the center of the formation, the red cloth tied prominently around his left arm. Even with Geronimo's protection, he felt the weight of 70 sets of eyes, assessing him, measuring him, wondering if he'd prove to be liability or something more useful. He kept his rifle secured to his saddle and his hands visible, making no movements that could be mistaken for threat or cowardice. Sarah moved steadily beneath him, seemingly unfazed by being surrounded by Apache war horses. The mare had always been practical about danger. Acknowledge it, respect it, but don't let it stop you from putting one hoof in front of another. Caleb envied her that clarity. Nalin had been left behind with the healers and a guard of 10 warriors. Before they departed, she'd called out to Caleb, her voice still weak but insistent. Naiche had translated, "She says you must come back. She says you are Shilnai, friend, and friends do not die for strangers' wars." Tell her I'll try, Caleb had said, knowing it was the only promise he could make. Now as they rode through the afternoon heat, he found himself beside Naiche, who seemed to have appointed himself as translator and reluctant guardian. The older warrior rode with easy grace, his body moving with the horse as if they were a single being. You are afraid, Naiche observed. It wasn't a question. I'd be a fool not to be. Yes, but you ride anyway. This is interesting. Nietzsche glanced at him sideways. Most white men, when given choice between safety and honor, choose safety. You could have run this morning. We would not have followed. My brother's word was given. You had already earned your life by saving Nalin. Then why am I here? Because Goyakla knows that saving one Apache girl will mean nothing to your people unless they understand why we fight. You will be witness. You will carry story back to white settlements. You will tell them that we do not make war for pleasure, but for survival. Nietzsche's voice was matter of fact. You will tell them what happens to men who shoot our children. Caleb watched the horizon where heat waves turned the distance into liquid shimmer. They won't care. White folks I know, they'll hear I rode with Geronimo and they'll call me traitor, or worse. Perhaps, but you will have told truth. What they do with truth is their burden, not yours. They rode in silence for a time. Around them, the warriors moved without speaking, communication happening through subtle gestures and shared understanding. These were men who'd fought together for years, who knew each other's movements as well as their own. Caleb had fought in the war, had been part of a cavalry unit that moved with similar unity, but this was different. These men weren't fighting for distant politicians or abstract principles. They were fighting for their families, their land, their right to exist. That made them far more dangerous than any army. As the sun dropped lower, Geronimo rode back through the formation, checking positions, speaking briefly with various warriors. When he reached Caleb, he reined in his paint horse and studied him with those uncompromising black eyes. You are wondering what you will see tonight, Geronimo said. Yes, you will see justice, not mercy. We have been shown too little mercy to offer it freely, but justice. He leaned forward slightly. These buffalo hunters, they do not only kill buffalo. Last month, they came upon a rancheria, a camp of women and children gathering acorns. They killed 6 children, 3 women. They took scalps to sell in Mexico. They left the bodies for coyotes. Caleb's stomach turned. How do you know it was them? Because one child survived. Hid in the rocks and watched. She described their leader, a man with yellow hair and one eye gone, replaced with blue glass. His name is Carver. Tomorrow he will answer for what he has done. You're going to kill them all. Yes. No hesitation, no shame. Would you do different if men killed your women and children? Caleb thought of the Comancheros, of what he'd done to them in the days after Maria died. He'd been methodical about it, tracking them one by one, making certain they understood why they were dying before he pulled the trigger. He'd felt no guilt then, and felt no guilt now. No, he said quietly. I wouldn't. Geronimo nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already known. Then you will understand. That is all I ask, that you understand and remember. White men think we are savages who kill without reason. You will see reason. You will see what your people have made necessary. He rode ahead before Caleb could respond. Near sunset, they stopped at a ridge overlooking a broad canyon. Red Canyon, Caleb realized, seeing how the stone walls caught the dying light and turned to flame. Below, perhaps half a mile distant, he could see the buffalo hunters' camp, a sprawl of tents and wagons, smoke rising from multiple fires, stacks of hides piled like walls. Men moved among the structures, perhaps 30, as Geronimo had said, maybe more. Too many for a fair fight, which was probably why they felt safe enough to camp so visibly. They were about to learn that safety was an illusion. Geronimo gathered his warriors on the ridge, speaking in Apache for several minutes. His voice rose and fell with the rhythm of formal speech, of war preparation. The warriors listened intently, and when he finished, they responded with a sound like wind through canyon, approval voiced without words. Nietzsche turned to Caleb. You will stay here on this ridge. You will watch. You will not fight unless attacked. This is Goyakla's command. Do you understand? I understand. When sun is gone, we attack. They will not expect us. White men never expect what they have earned. Nietzsche paused. What you see tonight, it will be hard to watch, but do not look away. Witness is not easy task. It requires courage to see truth and still hold it. He rode down to join the others, leaving Caleb alone on the ridge with Sarah and his thoughts. The sun touched the western horizon, and the world began its transformation from day to night. Below, the buffalo hunters moved about their camp, confident and careless, men who'd killed so often that death itself seemed like a distant abstraction, something that happened to others. They were about to learn differently about that too. Caleb dismounted and positioned himself where he could see clearly. He'd come this far. He'd chosen this path when he stopped for a wounded girl instead of riding past. Now he'd see where that choice led, even if the destination turned his stomach. The last light died. Darkness rose from the canyon floor like water filling a well, and 70 Apache warriors descended into that darkness like the answer to prayers no one wanted to hear. The attack came with the moon's rising. Caleb had fought in the war, had seen cavalry charges and infantry assaults, had witnessed violence at every scale from personal to industrial, but what happened in Red Canyon was something different. Not a battle, but an execution, precise and terrible. The Apache warriors moved like smoke through the camp. No war cries, no trumpet calls, nothing to announce their presence until knives found throats and bullets found hearts. By the time the buffalo hunters understood they were under attack, half their number were already dead or dying. The ones who survived those first moments fought back with the desperation of men who knew no mercy was coming. Gunfire lit the darkness in brief, violent flashes. Men shouted, screamed, died. The sound echoed off canyon walls until it seemed like the earth itself was crying out. Caleb watched from the ridge, his hands clenched around his rifle, his stomach roiling. He'd told himself he could witness this, that. Understanding required seeing. But understanding and enduring were different things. Each scream that reached him felt like an indictment, each flash of gunfire a question he couldn't answer. What kind of man sits on a hill and watches men die, even men who deserve it? The fighting lasted 20 minutes, then silence fell like a curtain dropping. Caleb waited, counting his own heartbeats, watching for movement. The camp had gone still and dark, then torches bloomed, the Apache lighting fires to see what they'd done, to make certain no threats remained. In the flickering light, Caleb could see bodies scattered among the tents and wagons. So many bodies. The buffalo hunters had been wiped from existence as thoroughly as the buffalo they'd killed, as efficiently as the Apache families they'd slaughtered. Justice, Geronimo had called it. Looking at the carnage below, Caleb thought maybe it was. But justice, like mercy, carried a weight that bent the spine of anyone who dispensed it. Movement on the ridge behind him made Caleb turn sharply, rifle half raised before he recognized Geronimo approaching on foot. The war leader's face was streaked with blood. Whether his own or someone else's, Caleb couldn't tell in the darkness. "It is finished," Geronimo said simply. "All of them, all who fought, 3 ran into the canyon. They will die of thirst in 2 days, or they will find their way out and carry warning to other buffalo hunters." Geronimo's voice held no satisfaction, just flat finality. "Either way is acceptable." Caleb looked back at the camp. Was Carver there, the man with the glass eye? He was there. He died badly, as men who kill children should die. Geronimo moved to stand beside Caleb, looking down at what his warriors had wrought. "You think I am monster now? I see it in your face." "No," Caleb said slowly. "I think you're a father who protected his people. I think I'd have done the same. But you do not like that you would do same." It wasn't a question, but Caleb answered anyway. No, I don't like what necessity makes us become." Geronimo was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried something softer than Caleb had heard from him before. Not quite regret, but recognition of cost. "My daughter lived because you chose mercy when you could have chosen safety. Those men died because they chose cruelty when they could have chosen peace. We are both made by our choices, White Eyes. Remember this when you tell your people what happened here." "What should I tell them?" "Tell them that Apache people do not want war. We want to live on our land, raise our children, follow the old ways. But we will not die quietly to make white men comfortable. We will fight to protect what is ours." Geronimo turned to face him fully. "Tell them that if they send more men like Carver, more men who shoot our daughters and take scalps for bounty, we will answer as we answered tonight. This is not threat, this is promise." Caleb nodded slowly. They won't listen." "Perhaps not, but you will have spoken truth. What they do with truth is between them and their own spirits." Geronimo started to walk away, then stopped. Your daughter, the one who died, what was her name?" The question hit Caleb like a physical blow. No one had asked him that in 7 years. No one had cared enough to wonder if she'd had a name, an identity beyond just lost daughter. Maria, he said, his voice rough. Her name was Maria." "Maria." Geronimo repeated it carefully, giving the syllables respect. "She was fortunate to have father who loved her enough to stop for stranger's daughter. This speaks well of how you raised her, that her memory moves you toward mercy." He walked away before Caleb could respond, disappearing back toward the camp where his warriors were gathering weapons and supplies from the dead. They would take what they needed, rifles, ammunition, horses, and leave the rest as warning to anyone who followed. Caleb stood on the ridge until dawn began to pale the eastern sky. Below, the Apache prepared to depart, moving with quiet efficiency. They'd lost 2 men in the fighting, not many considering the odds, and they prepared the bodies with ceremony, wrapping them carefully before binding them to horses for the journey home. When full light came, Nietzsche rode up to where Caleb waited. "Come, we return to our camp. You will eat with us, rest, and then tomorrow we will take you back to your land." "I can find my own way." "Yes, but Goyakla says you ride under his protection until you reach your home. This is honor, White Eyes. Do not refuse it." Caleb mounted Sarah and followed the war party north, away from Red Canyon and its silent dead. They rode through morning and into afternoon, finally reaching an Apache camp hidden in a maze of canyons that seemed invisible until you were standing in it. Wickiups dotted the canyon floor, traditional brush shelters that could be built quickly and abandoned just as fast. Women and children emerged as the warriors returned, joy and relief mixing with grief for the two who hadn't come back. Nalin was there, seated outside a wickiup with her shoulder freshly bandaged. When she saw Caleb, her face lit with a smile that transformed her from patient to girl again, young, alive, full of future. She called to him, and though he didn't understand the words, he understood their meaning. You came back, you kept your promise. He dismounted and walked over to her, suddenly unsure what to say, but she reached out with her good hand and took his, squeezing gently. Then she spoke in careful, halting English, words someone had taught her in the past hours. Thank you, Caleb. Thank you. For life. His throat closed. All he could do was nod. That evening he ate with Geronimo's family, venison and mesquite bean cakes, food shared openly despite the war that had just been waged. Children played nearby, their laughter strange and beautiful after the violence of the previous night. Women worked at various tasks, weaving baskets and preparing hides, maintaining the rhythms of life that persisted even in wartime. Geronimo sat beside him, and they ate in comfortable silence for a while. Then the war leader spoke. Tomorrow you go home, your obligation is fulfilled, but I will give you warning, White Eyes. More soldiers come, more settlers come. They will push and push until there is no room left for Apache people to live as we have always lived. There will be more fighting, much more. He paused. When that day comes, when you hear that Geronimo has left reservation, has taken his people to fight one more time, do not join the soldiers who hunt us. This is all I ask. Do not stand against those who showed you honor. I won't, Caleb said. You have my word. Good. Word of man who stops for dying girl is word I can trust. That night, Caleb slept in a wickiup provided for him, his first real sleep in 3 days. He dreamed of Maria, but for once it wasn't a nightmare. She was just there, sitting in wildflowers, her yellow dress bright against green grass. She looked at him and smiled, and he understood somehow that she forgave him for not being there when she needed him most. When he woke, tears had dried on his face, but the weight he'd carried for 7 years felt lighter somehow. Not gone, that would never be gone, but manageable, bearable. He could live with bearable. Morning came with mist rising from the canyon floor like smoke from a dying fire. Caleb prepared to leave as the camp woke around him. Nightshade appeared with Sarah already saddled, the mare calm and rested despite 3 hard days of travel. The older warrior handed him his rifle freshly cleaned and a leather bag that clinked softly. Ammunition, Nightshade said, for your journey, and this. He held out a small object, a medicine pouch made of soft doeskin, decorated with blue beads in the pattern of mountains. From Nalin, she says it carries protection for the road. She says you must wear it even if you do not believe in our medicine. Caleb took it carefully, feeling its weight in his palm, something hard inside, maybe a stone, maybe a carved amulet. Tell her I'll wear it. Tell her, he struggled for words. Tell her she honored me by living, that knowing she'll grow up, have a family, see more sunrises. That means something to a man like me. Nightshade nodded solemnly. I will tell her, but she already knows, I think. She has good eyes for reading men's hearts. She says you are still sad inside, still carrying ghosts. She says the medicine pouch will help, but only if you let it. How do I let it? By choosing to live instead of just surviving. There is difference. Nightshade gripped his shoulder briefly. Go with peace, White Eyes. You have walked strange path these past days. Few men could walk it and keep their honor. You did. Geronimo emerged from his wickiup as Caleb mounted. The war leader approached with something wrapped in cloth, a rifle, Caleb realized, newer and better than the one Caleb carried. This belonged to Carver, Geronimo said. It is fine weapon, better than yours. Take it. Use it to protect life as you protected my daughter's life, not to take life in service of those who would take ours. Caleb accepted it, understanding the weight of the gift. This wasn't just a rifle. It was trust and expectation and a kind of compact between two men who'd found themselves on the same side of something that mattered. I'll use it right, he promised. I believe you will. Now go before my warriors remember you are white man and question why I let you leave with good rifle. The words were dry, almost humorous, but Geronimo's eyes remained serious. Remember what you saw. Tell truth when asked. This is all I ask. Caleb rode out of the canyon with 2 warriors as escort, young men who barely spoke to him but kept watch on the horizons with the endless vigilance of those who lived in constant danger. They rode all morning, heading west toward where Caleb's ranch lay somewhere beyond the visible world. Around noon, they reached a ridge Caleb recognized. His land was perhaps 5 miles further. The warriors stopped, and the older of the 2 spoke carefully in broken English. We go no further. Your land that way. He pointed west. You ride alone now. Safe travel, White Eyes. Safe travel, Caleb echoed, wondering if such a thing existed for anyone anymore. They disappeared back toward the east, becoming part of the landscape so quickly that within minutes Caleb could no longer spot them. He turned Sarah west and rode toward home, if home was what it could still be called. He reached his ranch near sunset, half expecting to find it burned or looted, but the house stood intact exactly as he'd left it 3 days ago. The only sign anyone had been there was the gate standing open. He'd left it closed, and tracks in the dirt that showed several riders had circled the property before moving on. Caleb dismounted and stood in his yard, looking at the small house with its weathered walls and shuttered windows. 7 years he'd lived here, alone with his ghosts, convincing himself that isolation was the same as peace. Now, after 3 days in the company of people who'd shown him both terrible violence and unexpected mercy, the isolation felt different, not peaceful, just empty. And he unsaddled Sarah and checked the house. Everything was where he'd left it. His bed still showed the impression where Nalin had lain. He'd have to wash those sheets, he thought absently, get the blood out, return everything to how it was before. Except he couldn't return to how it was before because he wasn't the same man who'd found a dying girl at his fence. That night he sat on his porch with coffee growing cold in his cup and watched stars emerge in the darkening sky. The medicine pouch Nalin had given him hung around his neck, unfamiliar but somehow comforting against his chest. He thought about her in the Apache camp, healing slowly, surrounded by family who loved her. He thought about Maria, who he'd failed to save. He thought about Geronimo's words, choosing to live instead of just surviving. What would living look like for a man like him? Not ranch work. He'd never cared about the ranch except as a place to hide. Not more isolation. 3 days had shown him that walls couldn't keep out loneliness, only people. Maybe living looked like going to town occasionally, speaking to neighbors he'd avoided for years, offering the skills he had to people who needed them. He could treat wounds, deliver babies, teach others what the army surgeon had taught him. Small acts of mercy instead of one dramatic gesture. Maybe living looked like being useful instead of just being present. He'd have to find out. Caleb drained his cold coffee and stood, ready to go inside, when he heard it. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, coming from the east. He grabbed his rifle, the new one Geronimo had given him, and waited on the porch. 5 riders emerged from the darkness, silhouettes against the star-filled sky. As they came closer, Caleb recognized the lead rider by his hat and the way he sat his horse. Frank Morrison, the nearest neighbor, whose ranch lay 10 miles north. The other 4 were ranch hands Caleb had seen in town but never spoken to. They stopped at the fence line, and Morrison called out, "Reed, that you? It's me. You all right? Been hearing strange things the last few days. Talk of Apache war parties moving through the territory. Some folks said they saw smoke signals near your property. Thought maybe you'd been attacked." Caleb considered his words carefully. I'm fine. Ranch is fine. Had some visitors. But they moved on peacefully. Morrison rode closer, suspicious and curious. Visitors? What kind of visitors move peaceful through Apache territory right now? His eyes fell on the new rifle in Caleb's hands, and his expression hardened. "That's a fine weapon, Reed. Nicer than what you had before. Where'd you get it?" Here it was. The moment where Caleb could lie, could protect himself by erasing the truth of what had happened, or he could do what Geronimo had asked, speak truth, and let others decide what to make of it. He chose truth. "It was a gift from Geronimo after I helped his daughter." The silence that followed was profound. Morrison's face went through several expressions: disbelief, shock, anger. The ranch hands shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons. "You're saying," Morrison spoke slowly, "that you had dealings with Geronimo, with the worst renegade Apache in the territory." "I'm saying I found his daughter dying at my fence. I treated her wound. He was grateful. We talked. He gave me this rifle and let me go." Caleb kept his voice level. "That's the truth of it." "Jesus Christ, Reed," Morrison's voice rose. "Do you know what you've done? Aiding the enemy, consorting with hostiles? They'll hang you for this if the army hears about it. Maybe, but I'm not going to lie about it. A girl was dying. I helped her. That's all there is to it." "And that's all? Morrison stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "Why are you even telling me this? You could have kept quiet, and no one would have known." "Because," Caleb said, thinking of Nalin's smile, of Geronimo's complicated honor, of 3 days that had taught him more about mercy than 7 years of isolation. "Because truth matters, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs something." Morrison stared at him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, short and bitter. You know what, Reed? I always thought you were crazy, living out here alone like a hermit. Now I know you are. He turned his horse. I won't report you, not because I approve, I don't, but because I figure a man has right to make his own choices, even stupid ones. Just watch yourself. There's talk of more cavalry coming through. If they find out what you did, neighbor or not, I can't protect you. I don't expect protection. Just wanted you to know the truth. Morrison rode away, his men following. Caleb watched until they disappeared into darkness, then went inside. He slept deeply that night, deeper than he had in years, and when he woke the next morning, the eastern sky was painted with colors he'd forgotten existed, rose and gold and violet, the world announcing itself as beautiful despite all evidence to the contrary. Caleb stood on his porch and drank his coffee while sunrise lit the land, and he thought about what came next. Morrison would talk and word would spread, and eventually there'd be consequences. Soldiers would come, or officials, or just angry settlers who saw his mercy as betrayal. Let them come. He'd spent 7 years running from life. Maybe it was time to stand still and see what life brought to his door. The medicine pouch hung warm against his chest, and Caleb touched it briefly, thinking of the girl who'd given it and the promise it represented. Protection for the road. Not the road behind him, but the one ahead. Unknown and uncertain and full of choices he'd have to make without knowing if they were right, but he'd make them anyway. That's what living meant. Caleb finished his coffee, checked on Sarah, and began planning his day. There was work to do. Fence to mend, roof to repair, supplies to gather from town. Normal things, the kind of things that made up a life instead of just an existence. Around mid-morning, he was working on the corral fence when he saw it. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks, a heat shimmer on the eastern horizon distorting the landscape, but as he shaded his eyes and stared, the shimmer resolved into something impossible, something that made his breath catch in his chest. Riders, hundreds of them. They came in silence, a mass of Apache. Warriors spreading across the ridge like water breaching a dam. The morning sun caught on weapons and painted horses, on the bright colors of traditional dress and the darker tones of war paint. They kept coming more and more until the entire eastern horizon was filled with them. Caleb's hand went to his rifle, then stopped. There were too many. 500, maybe more. If they'd come for violence, he was already dead. But they didn't advance. They simply stopped, arranged themselves along the ridge in perfect disciplined lines, their horses standing as still as if carved from stone. Watching, waiting, Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He scanned the massive assembly, looking for some clue to their intent. Were they here to kill him, to honor him, to deliver some message he couldn't comprehend? Then movement at the center of the line caught his eye. 3 riders separated from the mass and began descending the slope toward his ranch. Slow, deliberate, giving him time to see they carried no weapons in their hands. As they drew closer, Caleb recognized them. Geronimo on his paint horse, Naiche beside him, and between them, sitting straight despite her bandaged shoulder, was Nalin. They stopped at his fence line, and for a moment, no one spoke. The silence was so complete that Caleb could hear his own pulse in his ears, could hear Sarah shifting nervously in the corral, could hear wind moving through grass with a sound like whispered prayers. Finally, Geronimo spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. 3 days ago, you asked why I brought you to Red Canyon, why I made you witness what we did to men who harmed our people. He gestured to the massive war party behind him. Now you understand. You are not just witness to one battle, White Eyes. You are witness to what is coming. Caleb found his voice. What do you mean? The buffalo hunters were only one wound among many. The American government breaks every treaty. They push us onto smaller and smaller land. They kill our game, poison our water, take our children to schools that try to kill the Apache inside them. Geronimo's voice remained calm, but beneath it ran currents of rage that had been building for generations. We have tried peace, we have tried negotiation, we have tried to live as they demand. Nothing works, nothing changes, so now we change it ourselves. You're going to war, full war. Yes, tomorrow we ride south into Mexico, then west to the mountains. We will fight the Mexican army and the American army and anyone else who tries to stop us from being Apache. Geronimo leaned forward slightly. Many will die, maybe we will all die. But we will die as free people, not as prisoners on reservation land that used to be ours. The words hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, announcing something vast and terrible and inevitable. Why tell me this? Caleb asked. Why bring 500 warriors to tell me what you could have said 3 days ago? Naichi spoke then, his voice gentler than his brother's. Because Goyakla wanted you to see what one act of mercy created. You saved one Apache girl. Because of this, he brought you into our camp. He let you eat with our families. He showed you that we are not savages who kill for sport, but people who protect our own. He gestured to the assembled warriors. These men heard story of white man who stopped for dying girl. It moved them, made them remember that not all white people are the same, that mercy exists even in times of war. I don't understand, Caleb said. Geronimo's expression softened slightly, the hard mask cracking just enough to show the man beneath. My daughter lived because of you. This debt cannot be repaid with rifles or horses, so I repay it with memory. When this war is over, when history judges us, I want one white man who can say he knew us as people, not monsters. One man who can tell truth about why we fought and what we fought for. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a weight that made Caleb's chest ache. My daughter is 13 summers old. She should grow up learning the old songs, making marriage, having children who know their people's stories. Instead, she will grow up in war. Maybe she lives, maybe she dies. But either way, she will remember man who chose her life over his own safety. This memory, your mercy, is seed that might grow into something better than what we have now. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. Nalin spoke then, her English halting but clear. You give hope, Caleb, that white people, Apache people, can see each other, not as enemy, as she searched for the word, frustrated, as human, as same. Tears burned behind Caleb's eyes. He blinked them back, his throat tight. I'm just one man. I can't stop what's coming. No, Geronimo agreed. But you can remember and you can speak truth when others speak lies. This is not small thing. Truth is weapon that lasts longer than bullets. He straightened in his saddle. We leave now. You will not see us again, White Eyes. When army comes asking questions, tell them truth. Tell them you met Geronimo, that he spared your life because you spared his daughters. Tell them we are not animals to be hunted, but people fighting for what all people want. Freedom to live as we choose on land that is ours. They won't listen, Caleb said. Perhaps not, but you will have spoken truth. That must be enough. Geronimo raised his hand in salute, a gesture of respect between equals. Live well, Caleb Reed. Live long enough to see what grows from the seed you planted. Nalin reached into a pouch at her side and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. She leaned from her horse, extending it toward Caleb. He stepped forward and took it, feeling its weight, its warmth from being carried close to her body. Open later, she said, when you feel alone, when you forget. She smiled, and it transformed her face into something radiant. Then you remember Nalin, you remember Apache people, you remember that mercy is this stronger than hate. She touched two fingers to her heart, then extended them toward him, a gesture of blessing or farewell or promise. He returned it clumsily, hoping she understood that he'd carry this moment for whatever years remained to him. The three riders turned and began riding back toward the ridge. As they rejoined the massive war party, a sound rose from the assembled warriors. Not a war cry, but something else. A kind of harmonic chant, low and resonant, that seemed to come from the earth itself. It raised the hair on Caleb's arms, that sound. It was grief and defiance and farewell all woven together, the sound of a people announcing themselves to history one more time before the world tried to erase them. And then, as one, the 500 warriors turned and began moving east toward the rising sun, toward Mexico and the mountains and whatever destiny awaited them there. They moved in perfect silence now. The chanting faded, leaving only the sound of 500 horses and 1,000 footfalls gradually fading into distance. Caleb stood at his fence and watched until they disappeared, swallowed by the land they'd fought so hard to keep. The dust of their passing hung in the air like fog, like a question mark, like the ghost of something that had almost been, but never quite was. When they were gone, when the land was empty again and silent, Caleb looked down at the leather-wrapped package in his hands. He unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a bracelet woven from horsehair and dyed red cloth, decorated with tiny blue beads that matched the medicine pouch around his neck. Tucked beside it was a single eagle feather, its tip painted red, sacred and precious, the kind of thing given only to warriors and honored friends, and beneath both was a piece of bark with crude letters carved into it, spelled out by someone learning English, each letter painstaking and careful. Shil na e friend. Caleb sank to his knees in the dirt of his ranch yard, the bracelet clutched in his hand, and finally let the tears come. He wept for Nalin, who deserved a childhood without war. He wept for Geronimo and his people who'd been pushed past endurance and now rode toward almost certain doom. He wept for Maria, who'd been dead 7 years but lived forever in the choices he made. He wept for himself, for the isolation he'd chosen, for the mercy he'd almost denied, for all the small moments where he could have turned away but didn't. When the tears finally stopped, he stood and went inside. He placed the eagle feather on the shelf above his bed, where it could catch the morning light. He tied the horsehair bracelet around his wrist, where he could see it always, and remember. The medicine pouch stayed around his neck, warm against his heart. Then he sat at his small table and found paper and pencil, and he began to write. He wrote about finding a dying girl at his fence, about choosing mercy over safety, about 3 days with Apache warriors that taught him more about honor than a lifetime among white men, about Geronimo, who was not a monster but a father protecting his children, about Nalin, who'd survived a bullet and a fever and showed more courage than most grown men he'd known. He wrote truth, even knowing it would cost him, even knowing that when the army came, and they would come, his words would be used against him, even knowing that neighbors would call him traitor and officials would call him sympathizer and history might call him fool. Let them call him what they wanted. He'd been called worse. The sun climbed higher, and Caleb kept writing, occasionally stopping to look out the window at the eastern horizon where 500 warriors had stood in silence, bearing witness to a mercy that had rippled outward into consequences he couldn't control or predict. He'd saved one girl. That girl's father had shown him that mercy created obligations, and obligations created connections, and connections, however brief, however impossible, changed the shape of things. Maybe Morrison was right. Maybe he was crazy for telling truth that would only bring him trouble. Or maybe, just maybe, being crazy was the only sane response to a world that made war inevitable and mercy dangerous. Either way, Caleb Reed had made his choice. He'd stopped running. He'd stood still long enough for the world to find him, and when it did, he'd chosen the wounded over the safe, the truth over the convenient, the hard path over the easy one. He was done surviving. He was going to live. Whatever that cost, whatever it brought, whatever came next, he'd face it like a man who'd learned that mercy was worth the price, even when the price was everything. The wind picked up, carrying dust from the east where the war party had ridden. Caleb paused in his writing and listened to it, that wind, imagining he could hear in it the ghost of that harmonic chant, the sound of a people refusing to disappear quietly into history's shadows. Safe travels, he whispered to the wind. All of you, safe travels. Then he bent back to his writing and continued bearing witness, one true word at a time. Years later, when soldiers came asking questions, Caleb Reed told them everything. They arrested him, tried him for aiding the enemy, and released him when they couldn't make the charges stick. His neighbors shunned him. His name became synonymous with traitor in the settlements. He didn't care. He lived another 30 years in that small ranch house, and he told his story to anyone who'd listen, about the night 500 Apache warriors stood in silence at his gate, about the girl who'd called him friend, about mercy that rippled outward into a world that had forgotten how. Most people didn't believe him. Some called him liar or lunatic, but a few, the ones who'd also known loss, who'd also faced choices between safety and honor. Those few listened and remembered, and sometimes late at night, Caleb would touch the horsehair bracelet on his wrist and the medicine pouch at his chest, and he'd remember that for 3 days he'd been part of something larger than himself. Part of a story about courage and compassion and the thin line between enemy and friend. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything.